Thank you, Liz. So we are where we are, and we're trying to keep this space free of Brexit ins and outs. We can touch on that later in the Q&A. So I want to pull back and have a look at a bigger picture and try to get through the noise. And I think it's important that if churches are going to make a constructive contribution as we go forward through these times of upheaval, we've got to be clear about what are the drivers, the causes behind where we are. Because we're seeing people turning inward, we're seeing a breakdown in social trust, but it's been a long time in the making. And really it's to do with decades of individualism, the individualistic society, which perhaps was a good response to what was happening in the 50s. It was necessary perhaps in the 60s, but it's gone too far. And we've seen extreme individualism on the right in terms of the way the economic system has been captured by neoliberalism, and we've seen it on the left as well as kind of social individualism, the me culture. So I think there's this bit, also this great de-alignment that's happening between the governed and those who govern us. And these fault lines that have come up over the last, say, 20 years at least, are now values divides. This is why our current political system is struggling to cope, because it's no longer really about left and right. It's about people struggling to catch up with culture change. And this kind of individualism over these years has, I think, led to three overlapping crises. A crisis of social solidarity. We're seeing rising in loneliness, in suspicion. People are less willing to engage with people unlike themselves. We're seeing a crisis of alienation, lower trust in institutions, a disconnect between the governed and the governed, the crisis of purpose, meaning. People have a sense of nothing matters. We're seeing rises in addiction, depression, suicide, all those kind of measures. All these have come from a kind of culture of individualism that's infected our life together, and it's driving us apart. And I think that the churches actually have a potential here to overcome the sort of binaries that we're seeing dividing the West, the sort of binaries that we see between old and young, urban and rural, left and right, conservative and liberal, anywheres, somewheres, the so-called open-closed divide, all these kind of polarizations. And the reason I think that the churches have the potential to overcome this, or at least to transcend it, is because we ourselves cover all those divides. The churches, who are the churches? They're us, they're people. We are more than our hierarchies, we're more than our institutions. And I think that we have the potential, if we play our cards right and we're constructive, to help to build a renewed sense of community, to balance that sense of crisis in individualism. And we would talk about the common good as an antidote, and we define it in a particular way. We say it's the shared life of a society in which everyone can flourish, but it's generated as we act together in different ways that all contribute towards that goal, and it's enabled by social conditions that mean everyone can participate. And it requires us to participate, it requires us to take responsibility. So the common good is not a utopian ideal, it's something that exists between us, particularly when people come together across difference. So the common good is very different from community cohesion, which is a kind of government speak. Common good is about encounter between human beings. And there's something about our tradition, our Christian tradition, that understands the true nature of the human person, which is transcendent. And so that puts us in a slightly different category. And I think, frankly, more is expected of us, especially to be non-tribal. There's a great temptation now for people to take tribal positions. And I think that's something we really have to refuse. And I think that's quite a challenge. I think a lot of people in the churches actually are tribal, and even sadly within our own spectrum of traditions, we have a lot of tribalism going on. So I think there's a sense of examination of conscience that needs to go on there. The church, when it's really at its best, and after all, what I think most people including the unchurched, expect it to be is to be authentically itself, not to try to be like mainstream society, but also to be welcoming and to offer a sense of family, a sense of belonging to something that transcends the two-dimensional nature of everyday life. And I think there is actually an appetite for optimism. People are desperate for a vision, which seems to be very lacking from our politicians, who I think understandably are getting very bogged down. But I think when I've heard some of the churches say, you know, we're going to have 5 days of prayer, or, you know, that's our response. Yes, of course, that's our bedrock. That's how we start. Prayer is our cornerstone. But the question is, what do we do then? How do we respond? And action is important. So I think one of the first things is to say, are we really in touch with our own country? How well do we know other parts of our country? We're all living in tiny slivers of our society, and we rarely step outside those. So I think we need to take an intentional step to meet people who we don't know, and perhaps even to get on a train and go to another part of the country that we don't know. And I think that our denominations, our different traditions, bring so many different gifts to the table here. And part of what we do at Together for the Common Good is we try to cross-fertilise, and there's no syncretism, no sense of dumbing down our traditions. We're strong in our traditions, but I think there are mutual gifts between the Pentecostals, the Anglicans, Catholics, Methodists, Charismatics, so on, that we can be more effective when we work together, when we collaborate. And I think there's also a role for reconciliation here, but I think we need to be careful. There's quite a lot of talk about reconciliation in the churches, and we need to be very mindful that it's not actually a kind of attempt at re-education in a Trojan horse, as it were. When we talk about reconciliation, it really means respecting the other person's opinion and treating them in the integrity of their human nature, and recognizing that intelligent people come to different conclusions. So I think having a one-to-one conversation at least once a week in some depth with someone that we know we disagree with is really important. And we also need to reclaim the ground that's being claimed by extremists. So we can't let the far right, for example, claim patriotism. We have to reclaim a language of national community, which is something that everyone can buy into. So we need to be brave, we need to be courageous, and I think we need to be humble. The sense of a humble church, a church of humility, where we recognize our own failings, but our sense of rootedness geographically, we're local, national, regional, international. We can build bonds between communities that are estranged, between people that are estranged. And I think that's a really important contribution that we can make.